You started shooting videos in SLog3 motivated to get the best videos with your camera, and when it comes to the edit, your videos look like shit. In this video I'm going to show you some simple tricks I use to expose S-Log3 footage, all in a way that you can get noise-free footage. I'll cover both good lighting conditions and also low light scenarios, and how I use LUTs to grade my videos fast, all without any fancy gear. To make things simple, I'm going to show you how to expose S-Log3 videos with your inbuilt camera tools. So if you own any modern Sony camera, this is going to be working in your case. Exposure is key when shooting in a log profile, and it can make or break your final image. Since I got my Sony A6700, I've watched a lot of videos about how to expose S-Log3, trying to learn from the filmmakers with more experience than me. My conclusion is that this is not for me. I will return my camera and start shooting video with my point and shoot again. Well, maybe it was not that bad. With the newest Sony cameras, S-Log3 has been popularized because it's the picture profile that has the most dynamic range and also lets you have the most flexibility in post. S-Log3 was not commonly used with 8-bit cameras, as grading very flat profiles introduced artifacts like banding or color noise, but shooting in a log profile without some previous experience is not simple, or at least this was not how I felt about it. Okay, let's start setting up the camera for a scene that has enough light. I'm going to be shooting in manual mode, because it will give you the more control over the exposure. But in a run and gun situation, I might use S mode with 1/50 shutter speed to keep the 180-degree rule. For white balance, I'm going to use a fixed value of 5500 Kelvin. This way, all the clips that I shoot are going to have the same white balance, and I don't have to change the color from clip to clip later in post. This will simplify the process and avoid having different tones in different videos. I will start by setting 1/50 shutter speed to follow the 180-degree rule and have natural motion blur, and then to measure the light for the correct exposure, I'm going to use the multimeter and adjust the exposure until I see +.1.7 or +.2 in the exposure compensation. With these settings, you're going to have the least amount of noise ratio on your shadows. For the ISO, I'm going to use ISO 800, that is the base native ISO, and this is going to be the best value that you can use in case that you have enough light. If you cannot stay with the base native ISO, I would recommend to be as close as possible to that value, because this is going to be the one that has the less noise in the image and it's going to be the one that looks the best. I would recommend that you check which values are for your camera so you can stick to that value in good lighting conditions. To be able to preview your image and check if it's properly exposed, we're going to use the display LUT feature. This lets you display the LUT right in the camera so you can see how it's going to look after grading. I use the LUTs from Alistair Chapman that, apart from converting to Rec 709, also correct the exposure back to normal. I have the +2.0, +1.0 and +0.0 already in my camera, and I'll use one or the other depending on how much I overexpose the image. To be able to see properly the image in your camera monitor, you may want to set this setting of monitor brightness to sunny weather, or use the EVF if your camera has an EVF if you're planning to shoot outdoors. To grade the image, I'm going to use these same LUTs that I mentioned earlier, but this time in my editing software, Final Cut Pro. This gives me a one-click grading solution that I can tweak if necessary later. Sometimes I'll try the 3 that I mentioned previously to get the correct exposure in my final image. Now let's move to the most complex scenarios, because not all the time you're going to have perfect lighting conditions. Sometimes you're going to have less light than expected, or sometimes you're going to have too much light, and you need to change some camera settings in those scenarios to make your image look the best. If I don't have enough light and I cannot control the lights to make the scene brighter, I normally bump the ISO. The first thing I try is the second native ISO, 2500, but you can push up to 3 stops over the base native ISO, which in this case is 6400 without introducing a lot of noise. More than 6400, it starts being unusable, but you can still push it if necessary. In the end, not all final images need to be bright. If the scene is dark, keep it dark in the grading. Embrace the shadows that happen in reality. The image will only get noisier if you push the shadows too much in post, so keep that in mind. If I'm in a run and gun situation, I will use auto ISO with a range of 800 to 6400. If in the current scene you have too much light, you may want to use one of these, a variable ND filter, that will reduce the exposure of your image. Something that I learned recently is that when you shoot handheld footage, the 180-degree rule, it will add the motion blur in your image, but this will make more difficult to stabilize both in post or in camera stabilization, because the natural motion blur in the image is going to combat with these stabilization techniques. In case that you want to shoot handheld in a situation that you have too much light, instead of using an ND filter, you could increase the shutter speed to have less motion blur in the image and be able to stabilize better in the camera or in post-production, and you don't need an ND filter in this case. You may want to add this natural motion blur later in post in your video editing software. As this scene is too bright, to prevent clipping the highlights, we're going to enable zebras at 95+. This means that if we see zebras in the screen, we should reduce the brightness. Something to have in mind is that if you're using the display LUT feature in your camera, sometimes it may show zebras, but in reality the image is not clipping the highlights. This is because the LUT is applied and then the zebras are showing in this LUT. When using the camera built-in LUTs, this is happening most of the times, as these are treating the image as if it was exposed for natural exposure. In my camera, I've customized a button to toggle the display LUT function to see if I'm actually clipping or not. If you still have too much light and you think of decreasing the ISO value below 800, I wouldn't recommend that, because that's going to digitally clip your highlights and is going to reduce the dynamic range significantly. I would increase the shutter speed before doing that, or using an ND as I recommended before. You can see the Gerald Don video about this, where he explains the details on why this is happening. I link it in the description below if you want to check it out. Well, hopefully this was useful for you if you want to shoot SLog3, but if you still find this too difficult, you can use the S-Cinetone picture profile, because this is going to give you a good image without having to think a lot about exposing and also about grading later. It's going to have a specific look that, if you like it, is going to be what it is. You don't have a lot of flexibility later in post to change it, and also you will lose a little bit of dynamic range while doing that, but if that's what works for you, I think it's the ideal. But I would say that you should try both and see which one works better for your use case. Sometimes it may change from one shooting to another, or depending on the time that you have for grading later, you may want to have like a S-Cinetone because it's faster, or if you have more time, you may want to spend this extra effort in shooting properly SLog3 and then grading later in post. Let me know in the comments below if you have any tips and tricks for shooting S-Log, and also which picture profile do you use the most. I hope you like this video, so like it below if you like it, and subscribe for more videos like this one. See you in the next one. Bye.